Let's start really with, I think, the elephant in the room. Um, whatever you say, whatever you have been saying, newsrooms like Indian Express lap it up. We hear each word carefully. We imbibe a lot of your political philosophy into our editorial pages. It helps us think. And a lot of the intellectual elite love it, and you're a rock star. My question is, do you sometimes feel like, what's the point?
No. No, because the point is to prompt thinking about what we're doing and how we live together. And some people think philosophy resides in the clouds, in the heavens, far beyond the world in which we live. But I don't see it that way. I think philosophy belongs in the city, where citizens gather and argue and sometimes reason together about our collective lives, about the common good, about the meaning of a just society. And we do that even before we take up philosophy as a subject. Okay. So that's really, well, that's worthwhile, isn't it?
No, of course.
That?
No.
Yeah?
Look, we believe it is, but especially in the field of political philosophy, which is what you've and so much of your talks that I've consumed are around. Whatever you say, whatever we say, the guys who are winning elections aren't really paying attention, right? They're doing their own thing.
Well, it can seem that way. But the question isn't whether the people who are winning elections are listening to us, whoever we are.
Yes.
But, well, think of it from the standpoint of people who are interested in philosophy and the underlying ideas that move societies. The real question is whether we are listening to them. By them, I mean the people winning elections.
Right.
Including those for whom we may not support. Because, well, I say this reflecting on the Trump years. I think one of the weaknesses of elites who worry incessantly about Trump and who are confident in their conviction that people who vote for him can only be deplorables, to coin a phrase. Mm-hmm. We're missing something if we think about it that way, because nobody, even politicians who tap into grievances and anger and resentment, including resentment against elites, touch on something important. And so I think we have to figure out how to disentangle the legitimate grievances that figures like Trump appeal to disentangle those legitimate grievances from the ugly sentiments with which they are often entangled, connected. So we need to think and attend to and listen to not only those politicians, but also especially the people who are moved by them and inspired by them.
And if the grievances are shaped not in economic terms, but in cultural and religious terms.
Yes.
If that is what propels a right-wing movement,
yeah.
Does that become more permanent? Does that become more sort of deep-rooted?
It's much more potent, yes. In fact, the success of right-wing authoritarian populist figures and parties is usually a symptom of the failure of progressive politics. I certainly think that's true in the United States with the success of Trump. And so I think it should be an occasion not to look down on those people who are voting for Trump and similar candidates, but an occasion to ask if he is as disagreeable as we, here we in scarecrows, think he is. What does that say about us? Why is it that we have failed to offer a compelling alternative? And does it have something to do with the tendency of elites to look down and the cultural sources and sometimes the religious sources of populist appeal? That too is worth taking seriously, because a technocratic politics that assumes it's only about the economy misses the deepest sources, not only of the politics of grievance, but also of any politics of hope. A politics of hope can't just be about technocratic things. It has to address the deepest cultural and spiritual sources that move people, that give rise to people's anger and frustrations and resentments, but also to their hopes and aspirations. And for the most part, mainstream, liberal, elite, technocratic politics over the last 4 or 5 decades has had a tin ear to that dimension of politics and aspiration.
And this is a global trend. It's not unique to America.
Yes, because we see the backlash against elites in many democratic societies, and it takes somewhat different forms. But it's worth asking why. Why the appeal of more nationalistic politics, sometimes various forms of religious fundamentalism in various countries and societies, connected to the populist backlash. And I think it's because for 4 to 5 decades, governing elites embraced, I would call it a hubristic conception of the economy and of politics. The idea that a certain version of market-driven, finance-driven globalization is the wave of the future. It's a fact of nature, the advent of finance and technology and globalization. National borders matter less. The free flow of capital and goods and people across borders is the wave of the future, and anyone who challenges it or criticizes it must be parochial or backward or intolerant. And that hubristic picture essentially said, leave it to us to govern as technocrats, really. We're simply adjusting to the inevitable wave of history and technology. Well, that was a contestable picture of globalization, and it should have been contested and debated and challenged, and it wasn't really, not by the mainstream parties. In fact, going back to the 80s and 90s, the political figures who presided over this, it began really with the market fundamentalist faith of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. But even after they passed from the political scene and gave way to center-left figures and parties, I'm thinking of Bill Clinton in the United States, Tony Blair in Britain, Gerhard Schroeder in Germany, they did not challenge the fundamental assumption of the market faith. They didn't challenge the idea that market thinking and market mechanisms are the primary instruments for defining and achieving the public good. They softened, to some extent, the harsh edges of a pure laissez-faire way of governing. But they didn't challenge the market faith. And they depicted what they called globalization, with a capital G, as a fact of nature. Like the weather. Tony Blair said at one point, there are those who say we should stop and debate globalization. You may as well debate whether autumn should follow summer. Wow. So it was, again, Bill Clinton spoke the same way. It's not something we can turn on or turn off. We have to adapt to it. But that covered up a political and economic project that did bring growth to some parts of the societies. But it also brought deepening inequalities, and more than that, the hubristic attitudes towards success that accompanied it led the winners to inhale too deeply of their own success, to forget the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way, to forget the contestable character of the economic project they were insisting upon. And then when it seemed to come tumbling down with the financial crisis in 2008, that could have been a moment to rethink and reconstruct this way of thinking about political economy. But they fixed it. They patched it up and left it. They did the bailout and they fixed the banks. This created enormous anger on the left and the right. On the left, we saw the Occupy movement, you remember? And then the candidacy of Bernie Sanders suddenly challenging Hillary Clinton. On the right, it produced the Tea Party movement and the election of Donald Trump. And we haven't figured it out, but I mean, the mainstream parties have not figured it out since. But what they miss, this goes back to what you were asking about the cultural and spiritual sources of politics. The mainstream parties and elites still don't get that. And so the populist, nationalist figures whom elites worry about, rightly in some respects, they do get it. They're filling the moral void created by a kind of hollowed out public discourse, as well as tapping into the grievances. And that's where religion and nationalism come in.
Professor Sandel, when you speak about elites as the villains of the piece, or not villains of the piece is the wrong phrase perhaps, but
as missing something important,
yeah, but you know,
and creating the way, paving the way for these movements.
But when you see in America now, I think you can see it to a degree. In India, we've seen that the elites are not actually can be co-opted fairly easily.
Can be co-opted.
Can be co-opted, and I mean, so say for example, the liberal elite that had done fairly well in the last 40 years by the post-globalization world, can switch fairly easily to the politics of victimhood, to the politics of minority beating perhaps, or justifying it to a degree, to accepting the new normal of the populist demagogue. How do you frame that in the context of elites, non-elites, where they fit into all this post the kind of political shift that's happened over the last 10, 15 years across the world?
It depends what aspects of the new dispensation they're embracing and accepting, and what aspects they're retaining a critical distance from. So you would have to kind of help specify the form that this co-optation, as you describe it, takes.
Secularism is a Western construct, say they will say in India now,
yes,
which wasn't said 20 years ago. By the same people in this louder voice.
Yeah.
Or you could argue that nationalism of the kind we see now
yes,
was something that was always there, but suppressed. But this argument was not made when it was suppressed by the same people, for example.
Well, okay, let's take nationalism and secularism. Go right to the heart of it. I was speaking earlier about the technocratic, seemingly value-neutral picture that mainstream governing elites offered of the global economy that they were promoting. And this is connected to, it's not the same as, but it's connected to the question of secularism as a governing philosophy. Now, this goes back in the case of India to the independence movement and to Nehru, and also in the 1940s and 50s, there was a kind of faith in countries around the world that the way to a tolerant society, the way to avoid communal conflict and violence, was to insist on governing principles that were entirely secular, even to the point in some countries, as this liberal secular picture unfolded, it was a version of liberalism that insisted that citizens leave their moral and spiritual convictions outside when they enter the public square. And this, I think, was a mistake. A mistake for two reasons. First, it's not possible to decide fundamental questions of justice and law and rights and freedom and the common good without reference to substantive conceptions of the good life, of civic virtue, of how to live. It's not possible. So any politics or economic policy that pretends to be neutral on those fundamental questions of meaning and of the good life is implicitly making those choices without owning up to it. And people sense that. So it's not possible. But neither is it desirable to try to conduct politics in a way that is truly neutral with respect to contested moral and spiritual questions or questions of the good life. It's not desirable because what it creates is a hollowed out public space that can't persist for long. People want public life to be about big things, about larger questions of meaning and purpose and belonging and identity. And if a purely secular, technocratic, political outlook creates an empty public space, sooner or later that public space will be filled, possibly, by narrow, insistent, intolerant moralisms, which typically take two forms: religious fundamentalism or hypernationalism. These are the two forces that will fill an empty public space, a hollowed out public discourse, if that space is not filled with, even teeming with, contested but still substantive conceptions of meaning, of the good life, of virtue, of what's worth caring about.
And this trend carries even to the intellectual elite. I mean, even they are not shielded from this trend.
Right, because we all, even at the level, and here I'm using philosophy in the disparaging sense, even if philosophically they may think, I mean they, liberal, confident, hubristic elite says, I've been maligning them here. Even if they think it's much safer, less contentious, to try to keep moral and spiritual questions outside the public square. We all have moral and spiritual convictions. We care about things, and to insist on a sharp separation between public and private, to the extent that it creates this hollowed out public sphere, that misses something, that misses the deepest meanings that stir people across the political spectrum, including those elites who may be presiding over it.
And so it didn't surprise you, or doesn't surprise you, that elites are turning more and more illiberal. It's not because earlier we were talking about the people, the bottom of the pyramid kind of revolting. Now we're also saying that the elites are also turning illiberal. It's not just the bottom.
All right, tell me, because there are meanings, different meanings of illiberal, of liberal and illiberal, but tell me a little bit what you mean about the elites turning illiberal. I think I do know what you mean, but spell it out a little bit.
Akash?
I will bite this bullet. I think the elites are shifting, as some would argue they always have, with self-interest and power. They're following power and they're following their self-interest. And if that means abandoning some long-held stated values, that's fine.
But that's not, but that's self-interest, that's not turning illiberal, or is it? That's what I want to...
Turning a liberal for self-interest.
So I think
Is that what you think, Anand? Is that what you have in mind?
Maybe a liberal would be, let's make a more broader definition of liberal.
Yeah.
I guess it is, somewhere the strength of democratic institutions aren't as important as we once thought they were. The idea that, there should be a separation of church and state, for instance.
Yeah.
I mean, especially in the Indian context, this looks like a very imported concept. Yeah. I mean, we've had rulers and kings and, we've had all kinds of government states, all kinds of forms in India that have always had a spiritual person standing right, next to them and always being part of it.
Yeah.
So the things that we took, so this idea of keeping spirituality and culture out of the public square, it's a very post-World War kind of a conviction comes from the post of, after World War, because we saw what happened when they get mixed.
Yes.
The elite today don't mind that. The elite today in India don't mind moving to Dubai. They don't mind moving to Singapore. They don't see what they are gaining necessarily from a vibrant free press. They don't see what they're gaining from just civil liberties.
Okay, so all right. Well, there are two issues here, and it's really important to try to separate them. On the question of self-interest, embracing or putting up with illiberalism for the sake of self-interest, that's one thing. And I'll illustrate it with an example that I know better from the US. The support for Trump comes from two sources. There are traditional, well-off Republicans who went for Trump because they wanted the tax cuts and wanted deregulation, standard Republican fare. And they were willing to put up with the other stuff. But that wasn't why they went for him. That's the self-interest. But there were others who went for Trump, and they tended to be those working people, those without a university degree. Not because of their economic self-interest, but despite it. Because they were drawn to the politics of grievance, they were angry against elites, they felt looked down upon, and here was someone standing up to those who were looking down on them. Now, those are two different sources of Trump's support. Now, what's the relation to liberalism and illiberalism? Well, one abides it out of self-interest, the other is moved by it. Now, so that's, I think it's worth distinguishing those two sources. But you were making a stronger point about illiberalism earlier. You weren't just, this is why I think there may be a little bit of a difference in the way the two of you see this. I could be wrong. But Anand, you were suggesting, if I heard you right, that even for elites, the illiberalism has a kind of appeal. It's not just something to put up with for the sake of economic advantage. And this, I think, is the more challenging and intriguing possibility, because what it suggests is that a certain kind of national pride matters not only to working people who feel excluded and looked down upon and unrecognized, it matters to the society as a whole and to people at various levels within that society.
Yes.
And so bringing stronger notions of national identity and pride, which may be bound up with faith traditions, is inspiring, or at least alluring, across the society, independent of the self-interest. And I think there is something in that, too, and worth thinking about. whether that's, to what extent that's at work. And that goes to a broader point about liberalism. And you mentioned the kind of heyday of the liberalism of secular neutrality at the end of the Second World War, in the 40s and the 50s. Yes. Isaiah Berlin, who was perhaps the political philosopher who spoke out of that experience and as a defender of liberalism, wrote, "A wise man once said that to believe in the relativism, in the relative validity of one's own convictions, the relative validity of one's own convictions, and yet to stand for them unflinchingly, is what distinguishes a civilized man from a barbarian." This is Isaiah Berlin, a product of the 50s, of this way of looking. But I always thought that was a very strange insistence, that slogan. It seemed to me strange. Because if our moral convictions are merely relatively valid, you have yours, I have mine, there's who's to say which one is true or valid? If my moral convictions are merely subjective, why should I stand for them unflinchingly? Why shouldn't I stand for them provisionally or qualifiedly, or trying to think them through in the company of others and figure out whether I maybe should shed some of my subjective preferences in the light of clarity about justice or the common good. So I think there's a deep incoherence. I mean, Isaiah Berlin was a great figure, but a deep incoherence in that idea that liberalism can be based on the idea of pure subjectivity of morality. And that if anyone who thinks, the assumption is, that anyone who has deep moral convictions and doesn't see them as merely subjective preferences, that they're on the way to fanaticism. That's a terrible mistake. I think that instead, we should think of ourselves, insofar as we are grounded by or drawn by certain moral convictions, not as being on the way to fanaticism, but as being on the way to deliberating with fellow citizens who may see things differently.
And so what is, in your view, the state of democracy then, if what is popular is actually moving away from democracy, for the elite and for the non-elite, if we're kind of all voting towards sort of a way of life which is not as democratic as it was in the 50s and the 60s? Well, the convictions are not.
Are we sure that that's the case, Anand?
Tell me.
Is this a moving away from democracy, or is it a moving away from what seemed to be a settled consensus on secular neutrality, but that may actually have concealed certain governing principles and convictions that now maybe are viewed as contestable?
Yeah.
I think it's the second. So
right.
To bring...
So democracy is alive and well and thriving.
I wouldn't say that, no. I think a democracy is struggling and in peril. But the reason it is that our public discourse is largely hollow and empty of larger moral purpose. Democracy is in peril in part because this whole period of emptying out the public square of larger meaning brought in a lot of intolerance and brought in dangerous voices, a kind of populist backlash that contains some, that speaks to some legitimate
Yeah.
grievances, but that also comes with various forms of intolerance, xenophobia, racism. We see this in the debate about immigration in the United States, for example. So, I mean, that's one of the most fraught questions now in American politics is immigration. And it shows how there are dark elements of this, the xenophobia, the racism, the insisting that people who come across the border are criminals and pose a danger. That's the dark side. But the idea of national community, membership, belonging, that underlies some of the worry about immigration, that's worth discussing. That's worth debating. Unless, for example, there could be a debate about whether the only just immigration policy would be completely open borders, where people are as free to move across national borders as goods should be, according to some, or as capital should be. That should be a debate. That should be a discussion. That's an open question. What's the liberal side of that? What's the democratic side? It had better not be just the settled assumption that there's nothing to discuss here.
Yeah. Build a wall and let somebody else pay for it, and that's it.
Well, either that or
It should be all open.
It should be all open.
yeah, there has to be some debate as between those two polarities, it seems to me.
Professor Sandel, you know, this...
If I could just add one thing.
Yeah.
The reason we shy away from that debate, and here we, back to your sense of we,
Yeah.
liberal elites,
Okay.
is patriotism or national identity and pride have become suspect as part of this picture we've been kind of maybe unfairly painting of kind of liberal, secular, technocratic outlook. It's a mistake for progressive parties and politicians to allow patriotism and national identity and belonging to become a monopoly of the right. There is no reason it needs to be a monopoly of the right, because there are competing conceptions of what it means to express national pride and a sense of belonging. And progressive politics has long required sources of solidarity. The left speaks of solidarity. The right monopolizes the term patriotism. But the left makes a mistake to cede the language of patriotism and national pride to the right, insofar as left or progressive politics depends on making citizens alive to their mutual obligations in virtue of sharing a common life and a public project together. It has to speak the language of solidarity, which is to say, in the setting of the nation state, the language of patriotism and belonging and national identity. It may be a different conception of nationalism or of patriotism than the right, but then that should be the debate.
In fact, I would go one step further and say that I think the problem with the elites, I'm saying you're using the word "we" for me with elites. So if the elites will have me, I think the problem with us is that there's a tendency to actually look down on anything which is seen as popular.
Right.
Anything which is seen as populist or even popular. It
Yeah.
could even be music. It could be anything. Like it could be a Bollywood box office huge film. But like if it's done really well, if I'm really elite, I'm not going. I mean, I'm going to position myself as somebody who didn't like that because it was not intelligent enough for me.
And there's a problem with that,
Yes.
and I agree with you,
Yes.
but it's a problem that's illustrated by the fact that populism is now under a shadow because it's entangled with these other
Yes.
elements that we've discussed. In the US context, populism in the 19th century was a movement of farmers and industrial workers against the powerful elite largely in corporations, banks, finance. Then it was the railroads and the banks and the oil companies.
Right.
It was a movement against concentrated power that was unaccountable. And in that sense, it was a democratic, small d, democratic movement. Now, even then, it was not entirely exempt from racism and anti-Semitism. The early populist movement in the United States in the 19th century had a nativist strand. But it wasn't only about nativism and racism and anti-Semitism. It was about trying to bring concentrated economic power to democratic account. That was the origin of populism in the American context going back to the 19th century. And so it would be a mistake to view populism today as necessarily antithetical to democracy. It's a paradox if that were the case, because populism, strictly speaking, is a movement of ordinary people, typically the powerless, against the powerful. And what's happened is that center-left parties in particular, in democracies around the world, have lost credibility with working people. Traditionally, center-left parties, social democratic parties,
they represented the working people. Right?
Yes, against the powerful.
Yes.
But that's flipped. So that today, if you look at the vote for social democratic parties in the US and Europe, well, let's say the Democratic Party in the US, the Labour Party in Britain, the largely moribund Socialist Party in France, social democratic parties throughout Europe, the voting profile has flipped. It used to be that those without a university degree voted disproportionately for center-left parties.
Right. And
those with university degrees tended to be the better off, the affluent. They voted for center-right parties. It's the opposite now. Now, and by 2016 in the US, the Democratic Party had become more attuned to the interests and values and outlook of the well-educated, credentialed, professional classes than to the working class voters who once, going back to FDR and the New Deal, constituted their primary base of support. And the same happened to the Labour Party in Britain, and the same thing happened to the social democratic parties of Europe.
And in India, it's a little different, right? In India, and you know, you I want your view and sort of how you think about this. And you've visited India more than I realized when I was doing research on this. So you have a view that what's popular now, what's populist is not left, right. You know, it's actually, I think, just it's in a sense a revolt, or it's painted to be a revolt to minority appeasement. That's what's popular.
A revolt against what's taken to be
minority appeasement. That's the color that the political sort of populism has been able to paint.
And minority, just to be clear, because I'm learning as I go, minority appeasement means
The government.
Spell it out a little bit.
No, minority appeasement. I guess the question is.
No, it's important.
No.
Important. I'm not just trying to put you on the spot.
To some degree, there is the whole political popular movement in India, the last 10 years, has kind of come from a place of saying the majority will not apologize for being the majority. And it's obviously a very religious.
You mean the Hindu majority?
The Hindu majority will not apologize for being a majority. The Hindu majority was never a consolidated vote. That's what's happened now. The Hindu majority has become a consolidated vote. And they have been painted to be the people who were oppressed, actually. That's what I think has been so successful in how this government has done it. What happens when, you know, what happens next? Because in your examples in the UK and the US, it was a very different scenario. But here, you've been able to actually say the oppressed was the majority. So what happens now?
Well, I'm not sure what happens now, but when you spoke about appeasing minorities, I thought you might mean non-Hindus, or I thought you might be referring to reservations, but you weren't. Or were you?
No, I wasn't referring to
You weren't
reservation in that
referring to-
question.
yeah.
But I would love to come to affirmative
Yeah.
action at some point in this conversation
yeah.
on reservation.
Yeah, so you're asking me, so where does it go now? I don't know, but my hunch would be it depends, and it depends on whether the opposition parties can find the leadership, but more importantly, the mission and purpose to articulate an alternative governing vision that takes account of the importance of the things we've been discussing: national identity and pride, and the importance of giving public expression to meaning, including spiritual meanings. Can there be an opposition party or parties that can reimagine an alternative vision of democracy that draws on India's democratic tradition, which is itself a source of great national pride, rightly
Yes.
so,
Yes.
but that rearticulates the meaning of that democratic tradition in a way that can speak to the aspirations that Modi has been able to articulate and express to do with national identity and pride. There's not one single version
Yes.
of such a vision. And so I think what happens, how it unfolds, really depends on the political imagination and will of those who would challenge the BJP and their vision of national renewal, who
Yeah.
can articulate a compelling conception of democracy that doesn't depend on a purely secular, liberal, technocratic, neutral way of thinking about the nation and national pride and belonging and tradition.
Yeah.
That's a demanding task, but that's
And,
I
and,
think
and,
that's
and,
what's
and
required.
if you've been paying attention to our opposition today, that's a tough task to
Yeah.
expect them to kind of follow through on. But I just finish the. But assuming they do that, assuming they get all their ducks in a row and they're able to find a message that actually carries
Yeah.
and that works, but they lose,
Yeah.
right? But the other wave, the BJP wave, is so strong and so majoritarian and powerful, and it works. That side is undefeated. Voter turnouts are at all-time high. In a sense, we sort of people are voting, people are paying attention. People who never thought, people are talking politics in a way that I don't think has happened in a long time in India. So in a sense, political conversation is vibrant, right? What if the right wing does all the things that the left wing is afraid that they'll do, and they do it with the support of a large majority sort of voter base? Suppose, and I'm just saying, I don't see this happening, but hypothetically speaking, they say that we're going to remove the word secular from the Constitution because it was inserted in the 70s, it doesn't have to be there. Or they suggest to do illiberal things. What happens then? Would you say that democracy is in peril because they're able to do all of this? Or would you say democracy is fine because it's the majority that's voted for this? The majority has voted for all these, in inverted commas, illiberal things. So then is democracy doing fine if that happens? Or?
No, because democracy is not the same as majoritarianism. Democracy is not only about voting or about majorities. Democracy, at its best, describes a public culture of deliberation and ongoing argument and contestation. And so for democracy to flourish, it's necessary that there be sites and occasions for genuine citizen deliberation about these kinds of questions. You said, Anand, that democratic argument is vibrant. I was watching television last night and I saw a very fierce...
I would have warned you against doing that if you...
I was fascinated by it.
Okay.
Well, partly because there was an argument about taxation of temple revenues.
Yeah.
But the ferocity of the debate intrigued me. And it was... now, you could say that was a vibrant debate, or you could say it was a misdirected debate. And so what I have in mind is not exactly that. Now, we have, and I should say it, we have on American cable television and talk radio all sorts of rude shouting matches, partisan shouting matches, and ideological food fights. We have plenty of that too, some of it in our Congress. That, you could call that vibrant, or you could just call it voluble. And there's a difference. When I say that democracy is not about majoritarianism, neither is it about ideological food fights, where epithets are being hurled and where there's a high level of heat, but very little listening. But the idea of democracy as deliberation requires more than volleys back and forth.
Yeah.
Listening not only for the words spoken by the interlocutor or by the opponent, but listening for the principles or the convictions lying behind the position of those with whom we disagree. And that's a rare and special thing. And it doesn't just happen. And we're not born being good at it. Listening of this kind it's a civic art. It's a civic virtue. And it has to be cultivated and nurtured. And there have to be occasions for it. And the kind of volleys that I was describing, either in American talk shows or on the TV show I was watching last night on Indian television, that's not what I have in mind. That's not democracy, deliberative democracy at its best. But for that, we have to find ways of creating alternatives to social media, for one thing, which hooks us and keeps us glued to our screens by inflaming us.
And which you're not on.
What's that?
You're not on social media. You've chosen to stay away from it yourself.
Right, I'm not on it.
Yeah, so.
And my sons do. They're on it. I mean, to a point. But no, I'm not on it. So we need to find alternatives to that. But we also need alternatives to the traditional media settings for these debates. And we need to do better in higher education at equipping young people with the skills, but also with the philosophical background and engagement to argue together, to reflect critically on their moral and political convictions, to figure out what they believe and why. Because unless young people have that experience, they're not going to be very effective at engaging in discussion and debate with those who may disagree. And so democracy as the art of deliberation, of persuading and being persuaded, of listening, this is what democracy requires, this is why democracy is more than majoritarianism.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where is the incentive? This is for deliberative democracy from two fronts. One is from the populist government itself, or the populist leader itself, has a stake in making democracy less deliberative, perhaps, given the kind of, or the demagogue certainly does. And so does big tech, which is now one of the biggest forces in the world with unlimited money and resources. So the creation of this deliberative space, how does one, did it ever exist, say, in various contexts, in its ideal form, and how did it exist? And how do we reclaim that space in the context that we find ourselves in now?
Well, first we need to rein in the tech giants and social media companies, because they're corrupting the possibility of healthy public discourse. And they're doing it not because of the technology, but because of the business model that supports the technology. The business model depends on keeping us and our children glued, but also us, glued to our screens for as long as possible. And they figure out they can do this by inflaming us and enraging us. For as long as possible, the better to gather our personal data, all for the sake of selling us stuff through targeted advertising. That's a perverse business model, and it leads to these very corrupting tendencies. So,
And it'll get worse with artificial intelligence.
Sorry?
It will get worse with artificial intelligence. It'll just
Yes,
become...
yes, because it will be able to target us more and more precisely, and to engage us and inflame us and enrage us more and more efficiently. So I think we need to break that business model. There had been proposals to, either to tax targeted online digital advertising, or to ban it, for a targeted advertising, let's say, to children as a starting point, but perhaps go further and force these companies to provide their services in other ways, through subscription models, for example, or in other ways. But that's the negative response. That's trying to diminish the grip, the corrupting effect of social media platforms on public discourse. The more affirmative, because the answer has also to be more affirmative, not just how to break the hold that they have. We have to reimagine how to use technology and digital platforms and the internet to create spaces and occasions for public discussion within countries, but also now globally. And this, I think, can only be done through experimentation. Some of it can be funded perhaps by public-spirited private sector actors, companies, tech companies, ideally, should get into this, but also not-for-profit foundations and higher education should be experimenting. I mean, we did, once upon a time, an early experiment in putting online my justice course.
Yes.
You were saying, Anand, earlier you saw it on NDTV.
Yeah.
When we first did this experiment, this was before there were MOOCs, before online education was a big thing. We filmed the Harvard class on justice. And the idea was simply to put it on television and online and see what would happen. We never imagined that tens of millions of people would want to watch lectures about philosophy online.
Yeah.
But when we first did it, I thought, oh, public television, that will really provide, people an opportunity. And they said, but we have to create a website too, to put it on a website. And they wanted to spend some of the budget on that. And I didn't really know what they meant. Really, why should we do that? I mean, nobody I know, looks at websites. And no, this is what. So I went along with that. And only a tiny fraction of the people who watched it on television.
Yeah.
it was really online that people saw it. Well, that was sort of an early stage experiment. But if we're talking about democratic discourse, it's not enough to diffuse even worthy programs and courses on political philosophy. What's really intriguing to me is how to create, use the technology to create dialogue virtually that can be supplemented with in-person gatherings, classes, discussion groups. And so I've done a few experiments, others have too, along these lines. With the BBC, we did a series called The Global Philosopher, where we had a digital wall where we were projected, we could project up to 60 countries, people from 60 countries on the digital wall. And we took a topic: climate change, immigration, free speech, income inequality, a different one each time. And I was standing alone in the studio, but we had people from dozens of countries, and we had a debate and a discussion to see to what extent that could work. This was just before Zoom, so it was a novelty to have all of these digital images of people talking to one another. Now that it's been developed with Zoom and through the pandemic, we gain more and more experience with this. But creating experiments for local and global public discourse, online, but also in person. And ideally, I think they should be combined.
Right.
We have to experiment to go back to the affirmative alternative to the impoverished public discourse that we have.
Now, you mentioned the university as a deliberative space, so I think we should discuss Harvard, of course, where you are, but this notion, we see particularly that in the university space, even in the United States now, there seems to be a limit to free speech, perhaps, that there is, over the Israel-Hamas conflict, there's been the kind of, we saw university presidents summoned by the legislature.
Yeah.
We saw them have. What do you make of that, and what does that bode for deliberation, even in the longer term, on an issue as contentious as that?
Well, what we've seen on university campuses is not a good thing, because there has been a freezing up of openness to discussion on fraught questions, including the Israel-Palestinian conflict. But not only that, I mean, this problem was already arising even before the Hamas attack of October 7th, with regard to other issues. And I think we have to do the same kind of reimagining in the university that we've been discussing with regard to public discourse and the use of online platforms. There are tensions on campuses, and students do feel inhibited in voicing their views in public on sensitive questions. Within the classroom, and you've seen how we do it, in the justice class that I've been teaching for many years, I have not yet experienced that hesitation or reluctance, but that's because it's possible within a classroom, even with hundreds of students, to create certain norms and expectations, not by laying down rules. I've never given them rules in advance about what you can and can't say and how you can say it. We plunge into the question, and the norms evolve. Students get the sense pretty quickly about what counts as a reasonable intervention, as a respectful disagreement, and it works even on fraught questions such as affirmative action or reservations. We discussed, back when it was deeply contested, the question of same-sex marriage. Students were able to do this. And free speech versus hate speech are among the topics that we've discussed. And it works. But within the campus setting generally, I think we need to do a better job. And during this period, since October 7th, when campuses have been polarized by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there have been, I've worked quietly, out of public view, with a small group of Israeli and Arabic and Muslim students from the region who want to have dialogue. But it's a small group. We've done it out of public view. And some of them want to do something in a more public way, but others less so. And I did, to try to kind of nudge this forward, I invited an Israeli and a Palestinian, one Israeli and one Palestinian, friends of mine, to engage remotely. And they're both philosophers, an Israeli philosopher and a Palestinian philosopher, to discuss the conflict. And we did it as a webinar because many of the students, but it was public, so Harvard and non-Harvard people were able to join. In this case, the anonymity that a webinar provides did, I think, enable some students to attend who might have been hesitant to gather in a room like this and to be seen as kind of engaged in an argument on that subject. I think it's too bad that there is that reluctance, but these are some of the ways that I've tried to encourage kind of discourse that could ultimately bring people into a public setting to do this.
So, Professor Sandel, on the education piece? Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Just a quick follow-up. But what do you make of this seemed to us from the outside, it was a global story, of the state, or the machinery of the state, in this case the legislature, but getting involved in how a university internally handles this, whether that is through the kinds of processes, you're saying others. Right. Should it be an internal university matter? When does that, what is the line for us to invite policing of, or not policing is a strong word, but of other people having a say in what goes on in a free speech inside a university?
I think that in this case, it was a congressional hearing that Republicans in Congress were using as an occasion to beat up Ivy League universities, which they've been wanting to do for a long time for reasons quite independent of this particular issue. So they seized upon it as their opportunity, and they succeeded beyond, I think, their wildest imagination. Two of the three university presidents who testified have since resigned under pressure. Exactly. So, but it was a political ploy. It was a successful political ploy. I don't think it's a good thing. And you used the word policing and then drew it back. Actually, they have now subpoenaed all kinds of records and documents from Harvard and other universities as part of a congressional investigation. So this is not the role that Congress should be playing with regard to universities. The cover or the avenue that they use to justify it is they need to make sure that the universities are acting adequately to combat anti-Semitism on the campus. But somehow, I don't, no, now that's a problem that's worth taking seriously, but somehow I don't have a lot of confidence that highly partisan Republican members of Congress are well suited to help universities overcome that problem.
But would you agree that the limits of free speech, when I was in college, I was in Los Angeles, I was at USC, I couldn't imagine there was any limit to free speech in America compared to other parts of the world that I've seen and been to. That we're seeing that in America, that there is a limit to free speech here. It's showing, because the noisiest places in America were college campuses, right? And you were seeing
were.
Yes. I thought literally until like 2 months ago, I thought they would still be. So,
Yeah.
are there limits to free speech in every society, right? Like, I mean, in Israel, you can say anything, but you can't talk military. You know, is there a limit to free speech wherever you've seen even the most thriving, vibrant democracies?
Well, there are we need to distinguish two different kinds of limits to free speech.
Right.
There are legal, statutory
Yes.
limits. And
Accepted limits, society's limits.
Well,
society's.
but even this is debatable because some societies have laws banning hate speech, for example.
Yes,
And others don't. The United States does not.
yes,
Most European democracies do have laws restricting hate speech. The US Supreme Court has not permitted that. We're an outlier in that respect. So there's that debate about whether a hate speech, for example, should be legally prohibited or not. And part of that debate is a debate about whether it's the most effective way of combating hate. Part of that debate is about constitutional principles. But I think the limits on free speech that you're referring to now on college campuses are not about legal limitations, but about limits that arise from norms, what's acceptable, the idea of canceling those who fall afoul
yes.
of so-called allegedly woke opinion and so on.
Yes.
Those are the limits
Yes.
you're referring to.
Yes.
And those limits have to do with norms and what's seen as acceptable. And there are, well, how to put this? Students do report feeling hesitant to voice views that they think will be unpopular or not accepted. And that's a problem, certainly a problem for education, especially a problem for civic education. And so I want to do everything I can to lean against that.
Yeah.
To lean against that.
Okay. Professor, a small game, if you allow us to, because we've always heard you ask the question, "What's the right thing to do?" Right? Everybody familiar with what's the right thing to do? Yes. So if we can ask you what the right thing to do is, and
In general?
in general,
Or about what?
No. I'm gonna paint a few democratic dilemmas, and you tell us what the right thing to do is. So we've discussed education, so I will start with that. What's the right thing to do for the president of a top Ivy League university? If one of the donors calls and says, we need to pull out our donations, our endowments, unless you stop anti-Semitic sort of protests by students in campus, what's the right thing to do for that college principal, for that college president?
Well, first, to ask the donor who phones up whether they're right about the level of anti-Semitism that they worry about. Because if they are right, then the university is doing something wrong in the first place.
Okay.
And the issue of donor pressure as such is not the main thing. If the donor pressure is pushing for something that's illegitimate, then the right thing to do is for the university president to stand up and say, I'm very sorry, but that's not something that we can do. That's at odds with our educational mission. The anti-Semitism case is more complex because and this is part of what was going on in that congressional hearing.
Yes.
The Republican members of Congress who were pressing the presidents had set a kind of rhetorical trap. First, they insisted that pro-Palestinian protests that made certain chants from the river to the sea, for example, don't you agree that's an anti-Semitic chant. That's what they asked. And the college presidents sort of didn't quite answer. And then later they came back. If someone is calling for genocide, anti-Semitic genocide, shouldn't that be banned? Well, they had already defined the chant, the contested chant, as an instance of anti-Semitic genocide. And so the university presidents were trapped, and that's why so what they should say to the donor is, first, let's be clear about what the problem or the alleged problem is. If it's a legitimate problem, then you say to the donor, you've got a point, we're working on it, here's how. Perhaps you can help us. If it's not a legitimate demand, then you have to stand up to the donor.
Okay.
Expensive though it may be, but that's the mission of the university comes first.
And a related question from this.
I mean, for example, we don't want you to be reading or assigning this or that kind of book in the philosophy class or in a religion class. Then it's a principled question. The right thing to do is to say, you have to give us the
space to do what we think.
Yes, to teach as we see fit.
This whole episode, has the allure of Ivy League education overall in America and from students outside of America, do you think it has waned a little bit?
I'd be interested in your impression. What do you think?
I don't think at all. I think the...
No, but what's your sense of it?
No. My view is I don't think it's waned at all.
Yeah.
But
It hasn't waned.
But I wonder. Yeah. I wonder if you feel that way in the U.S. Because the interesting thing about India is that almost every student, I mean, either aspires to or will apply at some point for an American education. At least wants to.
Yeah. I don't think it has waned, though I should say this with a certain caution. After this whole thing with the congressional hearing and the aftermath, the number of applications went down. These were applications for early admission, so you can't quite know whether that'll be true overall. 17% at Harvard. On the other hand, Harvard gets generally about 60,000 applicants for 2,000 places. So I don't think it's going to be a serious problem in the long run, which is not to say that Harvard and Ivy League universities shouldn't get their act together and figure out how to restore a vibrant, uninhibited discourse on the campus. That's important, quite apart from whether there is a temporary kind of loss of luster.
One interesting, just to kind of connect a little bit, one interesting thing about American education is that sort of they're moving towards less reservation, less affirmative action. And in India, it's the opposite. Here, the trend is we're moving towards more and more reservation. We're 50% reservation. In my state of Maharashtra, you were in Mumbai yesterday, there's a new they've added one more community to the reservation quota. So we're pushing the other direction. Yeah. And America's pushing for less reservation. What lesson do you think one can learn from the other, more or less?
Well, the U.S. system has always been different to this extent. What the Supreme Court permitted until just recently, when it struck down race-based affirmative action, it permitted considering race and ethnicity as a factor in admissions so long as there was no quota. So there's one difference with reservations. Yep. They did not permit quotas. Now, you could argue that from the standpoint of principle, there's no difference in principle between trying to achieve greater representation informally without an official quota and setting a quota. I think the court, the U.S. court, was wrong to insist on there being a big difference between them. But in any case, as you point out, the U.S. Supreme Court just recently prohibited universities from using race-based affirmative action. And I disagree with that opinion.
Okay.
I think it was wrong. I think that universities should be allowed to take into account race, ethnicity, the life experiences that go with being a member of an underrepresented minority. So I think the court made a mistake there and was wrong. I think universities will still find ways of achieving diversity. I think we've not done a good enough job of taking economic class background into account in evaluating applicants. I think there will be a debate now about whether so-called legacy admissions should be done away with. Legacy admissions means giving a preference in admissions to the children of alumni. That's going to be hard to defend once it's no longer possible to give preference to racial and ethnic minorities. So I think universities should care about the background of the students who can compete for admission and should take that into account. And to that extent, I hope we don't move away from that.
And globally, you think that anywhere in the world that's where you that's where your heart is for all contexts?
Well,
because it's very different in India, right? I mean,
it is, and in India, it's in education and in government jobs in a way that is not the case in the United States. The U.S., mainly it's a debate about education, although it does have some bearing in hiring, but not in a kind of fixed quota way. So I would say the importance of affirmative action or reservations in any particular country depends on the extent to which those inequalities have left their mark on the opportunities that still exist. And insofar as that's true, and it's true in a great many societies, I think it's important to take those inequalities, to try to address those inequalities in education and in other opportunities. That which is not to say that any particular scheme, may go too far or be too rigid. I don't know enough about the details, so I'm aware in general terms about the extent of reservations and how they work, but making that's a judgment call at the level of principle, which is what we're discussing. I do think the patterns of inequality and disadvantage that bear on opportunities should be taken account of.
Yeah. Just take your argument from tyranny of merit, just to examine it a bit. In the context, in some readings, it seemed like it is a form of basically toxic individualism, where you believe that all your achievements, and not only are they yours and yours alone, not when you're successful, from the successful elite.
Right.
Not only are they yours and yours alone, that the people who have not been able to get that
Yes.
is through their own fault.
Yes.
So so the starting point of that in an American context is the individual is at the center
Yes.
of the debate, and it's a
Yes.
sort of hyper-exaggerated version of that.
Yes.
In an Indian context, we have a bit of a contradiction I'd like you to think about, two competing forces. One is that there's huge and deep inequality, which has to be addressed, and you have to bring people up in whatever manner you choose. But the other is also a deep desire for individualism, because family, caste, village, region, the entire urban people moving to cities is a way to be an individual, which is something that is actually not granted to, some would say, the majority of Indians. So how do those two competing things of equality also based on ascribed identity through reservations as a first principle, and this notion of wanting to get rid of your ascribed identity?
Yes.
How do you see that playing out, or how do you view that?
Yes, it's very interesting. What you're really describing, if I hear you right, are two different cultural expressions of individualism and what it means. And I think you're right that you've called it the toxic individualism that I write against in the American or the Anglo-American setting is the version of individualism that leads people to see themselves as self-made and self-sufficient. And that leads the successful to see their success as their own doing, the measure of their merit. And what goes along with this, and this is the theme, as you say, of the tyranny of merit, what goes along with that is the tendency to think, if I've succeeded, that I deserve the full bounty the market showers upon me. And by implication, that those who struggle, those left behind, they must deserve their fate too. Their failure is their fault. This way of thinking about meritocracy, it's interesting. I'll come back to the second version of individualism in a moment. Meritocracy, especially in hierarchical societies, seems an ideal worth aiming at, a liberating ideal. Everyone should be able to compete on their own merits, rather than to be held back by caste or class or race or ascribed identity. And of course, that, stated that way, it's a principle of equality of opportunity. Who could disagree? Who could disagree with the idea that no one should be held back by poverty or prejudice? But meritocracy adds this further element, this way of thinking about success. And the person who coined the term was a man named Michael Young, who wrote a book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, in the late 1950s. He was a British sociologist. And for him, meritocracy was not an ideal, it was a dystopian scenario. The person who coined the term saw it as a dystopian scenario because he saw this was the class system in Britain was breaking down in the post-war years. Finally, children of the working class had some chance to get a good education and to compete for jobs. That was a good thing, as he saw it. But he worried that as equality of opportunity became perfected, and as the meritocracy entrenched itself, those who landed on top would come to believe that their success was their own doing because everyone now has an equal chance, in this distant future, that their success is their own doing, that they deserve the benefits that flow from it, and that those who struggle have failed on their own. And furthermore, he said, those left behind will themselves absorb this sense of self-hate. I'm just not good enough. I'm not talented enough. I don't work hard enough. I belong where I landed. He worried about this, and he predicted, writing in the late 50s, Michael Young predicted that eventually there would be a populist revolt that would overthrow the meritocracy, he said, in the year 2034. He was right, except that that revolt came 18 years ahead of schedule. So he saw, but then people didn't heed the neoliberals we were discussing, some might say bashing, at the beginning. They embraced this meritocratic logic as the moral corollary to the neoliberal version of globalization. And they were, the elites we were discussing, were the victims of this backlash against meritocracy. Now, there is an alternative picture of individualism which does not see the individual as detached from background, family, tradition, upbringing, community, but sees those sources of our identity as ingredients of, the constituents of what it is to be an individual. Yes? Do I have that right? That's your second conception. And there is, I think, that's a version of individualism that is less subject to the kinds of critiques that I've leveled against the first kind of individualism.
No, actually, I'll correct myself a bit then. It is that, but it is also a desire to escape So it is also to say, I don't want to be my caste.
Oh, all right.
I don't
Okay.
want to be
All right.
my,
Okay.
I don't want to be my background. I don't want to
I
be my
see.
poverty.
Okay.
Why
So
did they
that's,
say that?
all right, then that sort of partakes of the version that I've criticized.
yeah.
I mean, I called it, going way back, I called it the unencumbered self. I've written against and argued against the idea that to be an individual is to be ultimately an unencumbered self, not claimed or situated or defined by my background, my family, my ethnic background, my religious. I've argued that that leads to an impoverished conception of the person as unencumbered that runs parallel to the purely vacant, hollowed out public discourse. There's a connection between the two, I think.
Just to add one more follow-up on this, but I would say, imagine the identity is a marginalized identity, say in terms
Yes.
of caste identity
Yes.
in India. And
Yes.
that is something that there is, for example, I'm told that the name change laws in India are some of the easiest because people should, it was a progressive thing to allow people to change their names, to get rid of caste identifiers.
Right.
That kind of individualism on the one hand, which
Yeah.
can be liberating because it is
Yes.
liberating you from this
Right.
access of oppression.
Right.
While at the same time you need your ascribed identity is also the reason for your oppression and then the mode with which affirmative action is taking place or through which affirmative action is taking place. Those two sort of competing ideas at the same time for people.
Right, and the tension, as I hear it, is between wanting not to be weighed down and burdened by an ascribed identity that's a source of disadvantage, while at the same time, well, I put this as a question, while at the same time wanting still to develop a certain kind of pride in one's past, which is hard to do if we detach ourselves altogether from the past, even though it's understandable if it's a source of prejudice and discrimination. And striking that balance is really the dilemma of forging an individual identity under circumstances where some sources of my identity may lead me to be the victim of prejudice and discrimination and exclusion.
So, what's the right thing to do? An Indian software engineer has an offer for a job that will double his monthly salary. He has to leave his family and live without them. Should he take the offer and pay down the debt that he picked up to study and enter this merit race? Or should he read your book on what money can't buy and stay with the nourishment of the family? What's the right thing to do?
Well, I hope those aren't the only two alternatives. I hope that he or she can read What Money Can't Buy and still feel the moral weight, the tug of family, even while trying to balance how to promote the family's good in the long term, maybe through a financial opportunity. So this is not to resolve the dilemma, but that's how I would frame it. And I would not deny to either the opportunity to read What Money Can't Buy.
You know, a quick point to just, I found this very interesting when I sort of lived in, when I moved to America for 6 years and then I came back. And one thing that really struck me was just how hierarchical India is. And just how, you know, the hierarchy actually makes the system work. And one of the places where that I saw it most, you know, in America, in contrast, it's all equal. Everybody's equal. Everything is equal. And that's great. It's attractive. It's fantastic. But on the other hand, if you take that concept of equality and put it into every Indian system, I get nervous. I think it'll all just collapse. I'll give you a small example and tell me whether my first day in college, you know, the professor walked in, my first class, I was like literally landed, first time in Los Angeles in my life. This old American professor kind of walks in, and I just ran up and I pulled the chair for him to sit on. I was ostracized from that whole class because they all thought, and the professor was upset with me. He said, I can pull my own chair. Why are you doing this for me? And but that's the way that education in India works. If you're not so servile almost to your teacher, if you don't respect him or her so strongly, you will not pay attention. I mean, it just would kind of collapse. Even in the family, there is the family identity in India is the strongest, I would say, maybe even more than the individual, even in the people fighting for individualism and stepping out of these identities, family is one that I think is the stickiest. Yeah. There is a head of a family, almost always. It could be a matriarch, could be a patriarch, but there is a sort of hierarchy. So do you think about this idea of equality mixing with old cultures like India? Japan is similar, China is similar. How is there a way for this to merge seamlessly, or will it create a lot of havoc when it happens?
Just to add to Anand's question, now we will also have, there's a sort of new way of thinking that's coming on, articulation, which would say that the notion of equality that we're talking about is in fact a Western construct, as is the notion of democracy we might be talking about, of a deliberative, because this was always here as an Indic principle in ancient republics, perhaps. So there is that the deliberative democracy of India is that Indian democracy is intrinsic and self-emergent. So even that, so that's what it sort of feeds into this idea that a lot of these ideas, are they non-universal?
I don't know. We can't know until we try and test. And the tests arise in moments. I think it's a sweet story, Anand, about your offering the chair, even though you were ostracized for it. It's a sweet story because it reflects a gesture that grew out of your experience and your sense of respect for the teacher. And it was dissonant. It was a dissonant moment for them because they saw it as misplaced. And yet there is something, sweet about it. And you asked, can it happen seamlessly, translating different notions of equality and of individuality, one culture to the next? Seamlessly, no. But sometimes noticing the seams, the dissonances, the awkward moments, these can be the most enriching moments and the occasion for learning and sometimes reconfiguring or reimagining ways of understanding equality and respect, because this is about respect as much as it is about equality. What does it mean to respect human dignity and to respect people who perform certain functions or who are assuming certain roles? There's no single right answer to these questions. The seams that arise, sometimes awkwardly or with dissonance, are the moments when mores and morals come together and the line blurs. We sometimes think morality, that's about principles. That's about right and wrong. That's about justice and injustice. That's about principles. Whereas mores, habits of behavior and conduct, informal norms, attitudes toward teachers, toward family, toward parents, these are mores, they're not principles exactly. But it seems to me that morals and mores come together. The line between them blurs, and it blurs in a way that can create moments of learning and of deepening understanding when we notice the space in the seams. And we should, I think, cherish that despite the awkwardness it sometimes brings.
Generally, one side wins. Equality wins with the younger people, and the respect wins with the older people. So,
Well, I was thinking
Well,
as
on
you
top
were
of the
telling
pyramid.
the story, what I was about to say, I'd kind of welcome one of my students coming and bringing it, but or would I? Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
okay, we'll do one sort of last what the right thing to do is. So, India-China relations are getting tough, unrest on the border. Indian tech entrepreneur gets an investment offer from a strategic Chinese company. What's the right thing to do?
To go work there, do you mean?
No, he gets an offer for investment or buyout of his Indian. So an Indian entrepreneur gets an offer for an investment from a Chinese
Oh,
company
I
to
see.
his Indian
I
to
see.
his Indian
To his Indian firm.
Indian firm. Yeah.
Well, it might depend on, there might be the need to ask a lot of questions about the whether that investment would carry control, and if so, what kind of control, what the governance structure of the corporation would be. Do we know that?
Let's for a second assume that he remains in control, but obviously it's a sizable investment. So so the Chinese company's on the board. He certainly is an influential entity in the company.
Well, I think it depends on the concrete, practical arrangements that can be negotiated. I would say that if it meant ceding control altogether at that extreme, then maybe forego it. I mean, in a way, though the company you've described or the technology you described is not quite the same as the university example, there is a certain similarity to the example you asked about the donor calling and saying, do this or do that. And there my answer was, it depends whether what the donor wants is legitimate, in line with the university's mission. Perhaps the university has strayed from its mission. Or is it at odds with the mission? And a similar kind of analysis, I think, would have to be worked out here, wouldn't it?
So I think what I want you to kind of take you with this example is that I feel corporates have in a sense they've in a sense become the new royalty. They've become the new strategic asset in the arsenal of a country. Yeah. Do you agree that the corporate power, the power that businesses wield today in society is much more than it was earlier, and therefore now, on the one hand the flag is important. On the other hand, even though they wield all this power in their society and in their country, they don't seem to care about the border as much as the voter cares. The voter cares about the country and the nationalism. But the corporate, even though it's a strategic asset, doesn't seem to care too much about the flag.
Right. Should there be such a thing as corporate economic patriotism? That's the question
That's
you're
the
really
question.
asking.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. And my answer to that is up to a point. But I think it's hard to answer once and for all. I don't think that corporations, however powerful, should be a law unto themselves, should be as if sovereign nations. I think corporations should be, however global in their outlook, and that's admirable, and in their reach, should still be alive to their national settings and should not be entirely heedless of the common good of their own society.
President, a follow-up now. Given the power corporates enjoy and big corporations over elections, over political parties, do you think the new church and state separation might need to be business and politics, and with strict, clear lines on how they can interact?
You mean given the power of money in politics?
Money and politics, and so then big business and politics.
I'll just add to his question. Sorry, by the way. Is there a clean way for any political party to raise money from corporates?
From corporates?
Anywhere in the world that you've seen, is there a clean way for?
No, I haven't seen a way. I can imagine a way.
Okay.
But the only way would be, well, corporates might not like this, but the only way, I think the only way to establish a church-state division between money and politics is to have publicly financed campaigns with spending limits, and you raise the funds for the public financing of campaigns through taxation, including taxation on corporates. So you could call that corporate-funded political campaigns, but not of the kind that the corporates would perhaps welcome, because, well, what I was going to say is that the corporate contributions should be anonymous to everyone, to all parties. And that can only really be achieved in practice through a system of taxation that funds publicly financed campaigns.
Super. Okay, we're going to get some, can I get a sense of how many questions there are in the audience before we get to audience questions? Okay, so, you know, I asked Professor Sandel before this, I said, look, you know, we would love to be with you till midnight. And you know, he didn't flinch when I said midnight. But I did say, when I say midnight, I think we'll try for a couple of hours. So before we get to the audience question, Professor Sandel, I'll just do a quick rapid fire with you.
Okay.
And then we get to the audience, and the audience has been very patient, but I think they haven't moved a muscle, because that's kind of how keen they are to kind of hear from you. If we look at, so rapid fire, have fun with it, and, you know, short answers, right? If we look at the history, all the history of humanity, since the beginning of time, are we moving more or less, are we moving more leftward or more rightward?
Neither, because what changes is the definition of what's left and what's right.
Okay, okay. No? What is Michael Sandel's state of mind? Are you optimistic? Are you scared? Are you cautiously optimistic?
I would distinguish between optimism and hope. Given the peril that democracies face in countries around the world, and given the parlous, hollowed state of public discourse, it's very hard to be optimistic. But I do have hope, and the hope arises every time, especially when I travel, but every time when I encounter especially young people, where I find a hunger, a yearning to engage in a better kind of public discourse than the kind to which we're accustomed. And that hunger, that energy, that passion, that spiritedness that I see, and we had a session yesterday, the INET YSI session at IIT Bombay. The engagement of young people especially in debating big questions and in listening to one another and responding to one another, that gives me hope that we can reimagine the terms of public discourse in a way that lifts up and elevates our arguments rather than leaves us with the shouting matches.
That's wonderful. And I'll also just add to your sort of feelings of hope that even we have seen, getting close to the elections, that the amount of interest there is in intelligent conversation on politics, and there's a reach of it. So just to add to that. Okay. So a reminder maybe, but answer in one line. Why should a party care for a minority?
I need 2 lines.
Okay.
For 2 reasons. First, because one day they too will be in the minority. Second, even more importantly, even if they can't bring themselves to imagine that possibility, respecting the minority is a fundamental condition of the mutual respect on which a decent society depends.
Okay. The one mistake that Indian democracy must learn to avoid from American democracy.
not allowing money to dominate politics and political campaigns.
The one thing that Indian democracy should learn to emulate from American democracy.
The social equality that we don't fully live up to, but that you described in the charming story you told a moment ago.
Okay. The one thing that American democracy should learn to emulate from Indian democracy.
The spirited passion for politics.
Equality or liberty, if you choose one?
I can't, because properly understood, they go together. Each depends on the other.
Okay. What is success for Michael Sandel?
Managing to contribute, even modestly, to promoting a better kind of public discourse across countries and across cultures.
Okay. The one secret ingredient to American soft power.
Well, the answer may have changed after January 6th and the attack on the Capitol, which I think startled many people who look to America as a symbol of democracy. But I think the length, and I hope the persisting hold of democratic institutions is, and the liberty, this goes back to the previous question, to the freedom that makes possible, not only toxic individualism, individual freedom, but civic freedom, the ability to stand on one's own 2 feet, to speak one's mind as a citizen, as an equal.
Okay.
I think that ideal, though we realize it imperfectly, is an important source of the regard that people have around the world for America.
And would you say that's under threat after Capitol Hill, after Afghanistan, after so many sort of things that are happening in American politics, and even the popularity of Trump in spite of Capitol, the popularity of Trump for this election?
Yeah, and the fact that Trump has persuaded most of the Republican Party that the election was stolen, that's serious, and that does call into question, even beyond the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th, who were relatively few, the fact that millions of people believe his lie that he really won the election and that it was stolen from him, that's very worrying. And how it plays out is an open question.
Okay. The one magic bullet that can fix social media.
Ban targeted online advertising.
Okay. The one necessary...
That's too radical for some. I think there were some who liked it, and there were others who were not so sure. Okay.
The one necessary condition for being a liberal in the year 2024.
Well, if we mean liberal in the good sense, that and not the desiccated version, the one important thing to being a liberal, a good liberal, is to listen carefully to, rather than vilify those who disagree. Yeah.
And what's the one condition for being a good conservative? Same answer?
Same answer.
Yeah. Okay. Henry Ford or Elon Musk? Who is Michael Sandel's choice of capitalist?
Am I forced to choose between those two? Well, Henry Ford, there were a lot of problems with Henry Ford. The one thing that would lead me to to go for him, though it's restricted, my admiration is limited to this feature of Henry Ford, that he recognized that the best way to develop the auto industry was to pay workers enough so that one day they could buy the Ford car that they were making. There was a deep insight in that, and it's an insight that's lost, I think, on much of capitalism today. Now, Ford was also a notorious anti-Semite, and he had a lot of problems. But in that one respect, as a capitalist, that insight, I think, is worth heeding.
Should intellectuals be on Twitter?
I don't know what happens on Twitter. I've never. Why would they want to be? Why would they want to be?
Okay, some audience questions, please. Show of hands here. Wow, okay. So we'll take two at a time. Is that okay? First, Andrew?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah? Okay. Yes, the lady right in the third row, and then in the middle behind that. Yeah? Please keep it short and please keep it to a question.
Hi. You talked about moral limits of markets, and I was wondering if you also see any moral limits to democracy insofar as it is conflated with populism and majoritarianism. You talked about the importance of listening, but my question is more, do you see any fundamental goods, like you talked about a decent society, and what are the fundamental things that make that decent society that can override popular will? If popular will goes against...
That can override...
That you think should, if popular will undermines those fundamental goods, like equality or justice. What fundamental goods do you see that are non-negotiable for a decent society?
Right, well, let me just answer that really quickly, like the one answer. Basic respect for the rights of the minority, including religious liberty. The majority should not be able to override that.
Please.
For one.
Back in 2010, when you spoke about, in your TED talk, The Lost Art of Democratic Debate, you had mentioned that when it comes to civil debate, we are shamefully out of practice.
Shamefully out of
practice. 14 years on, where do you think we stand?
Worse.
So what's going to be our takeaway term for shamefully out of practice? I think that was my first question. And a quick follow-up on a much lighter note. I note that instead of democratic debate, we've used deliberation, discussion, and discourse today a lot more. Do American cable TV channels and Indian cable TV channels have anything to do with that switch from debate to discourse?
It could be that the shift is because debate has been discredited because of its association with the shouting matches and the food fights, the partisan food fights that often appear on cable television or other forums. I would like to redeem the term debate from that shallow shouting match picture to make it more continuous with discourse, but I think that accounts for speaking less of debate and more of deliberation.
Good evening, sir. Yes.
Yes. Oh, there you are. Yeah.
So it's debatable that the free market economy has not done justice to equality, or it has done justice to equality and establishment of the welfare state. Perhaps that's because the fundamental construct is at odds with the objective, and perhaps some of it also has to do with the hubris that you alluded to. Do you think a hash of that same free economy model, as we are increasingly see it play out, will be able to deliver the climate agenda?
Will the market faith deliver the climate agenda, are you asking? Well, the short answer is no. No, because to figure out how to cooperate together to make the transition to a green economy, economic incentives can play an important part. A carbon tax, I think, could play an important part. But fundamentally, we need to change norms. We need to change the way we live with nature. And shifting attitudes, this goes back to a theme that's run through our discussion, is not something that can be achieved by economic incentives or market mechanisms alone. It requires political deliberation, it requires persuasion, it requires shifting the way we understand our relation and live with nature.
And America can learn a lot from India about living in harmony with nature, but it refuses to. It always comes and tells us how to deal with climate change, right? I mean, do you see that? Do you see that kind of that contradiction that, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. I think we need, if living with nature,
Yes.
rethinking that is part of making a transition to a green economy. This is a perfect example of how spiritual traditions
Yes.
are relevant and important, and mutual learning from spiritual traditions that accord greater emphasis and weight to harmony with nature, I think, is an important part of the deeper transition that we need to make. And that requires, I think, certainly from an American point of view, learning from other traditions.
Older countries.
Yeah.
Is there a question around jurisprudence or anything to do in the legal space? Can I? Yeah, because that's one thing we haven't spent much time on. Quickly there. Yes, I'll come back.
Good evening, Professor. That was very thought-provoking lecture. I really appreciate that. I practice constitutional law in Supreme Court here. I want to understand democracy. I agree with you when you say democracy is not majoritarianism. And I disagree with you when you say democracy is a culture, is what's going on. In the context, if we have a direct voting today, majority
If we have,
are direct voting today in United States, majority of Americans will say don't send 60 billion to Ukraine rather than spend on us. But America, if sends $60 billion to Ukraine to support a war and says this is because we are a vibrant democracy. So I feel, no, it is not the will of the people, but in the name of the will of the people, you are sending that, you are doing something against the will of the people. So then what is democracy? That's my question.
A related question, but okay.
In
Just a short,
2024,
please.
yeah, very short. 2024, 64 countries, perhaps even 70 countries, are heading in for elections. So can we hope that we live in a very democratic world?
okay, well, shall I take those
Yeah.
two questions
Together,
together? Or did someone else has a question on democracy? Maybe while we're on that topic.
Anyone
you want-
else? Question democracy on that topic? Okay. Why don't you go there then? So, yeah. Just trying to.
I am Ravindra Garia. I am also a lawyer. Sir, I would like to ask if within the present constitutional framework, maybe a right-wing government whose supporters, we say, hate the elite or the intellectual middle class, as they say. This government wins an election. How will we say that the country is not so democratic as it was earlier, or the democratic traditions are going down? What's the reason for saying so?
Okay, if a populist government wins election or re-election, how can liberals say that this is threat?
Because it's not tinkering with the constitutional framework or the constitutional guarantees that are there. If it is not tinkering
Because
Free
it's
and
not-
fair election. They won a free and fair
If
election.
it wins
tinkering
freely,
with the text at least,
yes,
how do we say that?
yes. Well, then I think we would say that the people have spoken and that the government that's been elected or re-elected has a democratic legitimacy and right to rule, and that those who disagree with that government or with that candidate have to figure out how to persuade the public that their mission and purpose and agenda is better. And it's I think that's the only conclusion to be drawn. Now, if a government wins election or re-election and is in power for an extended period of time and begins to erode or to change the basic constitutional framework in ways that undermine democracy and liberty and respect for minority communities, then that's a different matter. Then that does constitute an erosion of democracy. And to move from the Indian context to the American context, Donald Trump is claiming that this time when he's in office, he'll get better control over the administrative apparatus. The last time, those of us who worried about Trump found that there was a small saving grace, which is that his malevolence was exceeded by his incompetence at governing. He didn't really know how the government worked. This time, he claims he's had advice during his time out of office, and that now he'll find people who will really do his bidding rather than impose kind of institutional obstacles to some of the more extreme things he would like to do. For example, to use the military, to send the military into cities where he thinks there are protests that should be put down, that kind of thing. So if that happens, that I would consider that undemocratic or anti-democratic, even if ordered or carried out by a figure, a president in this case, who wins election. But it all depends on how intact are the democratic institutions, the constitutional protections, as well as respect for democratic norms.
All the countries going into elections?
Well, it is striking how many countries are going into elections and how strong and pronounced is the tendency in many of these countries to embrace what are sometimes called strong men, and they do tend to be men, the people who fit this description, figures who project a kind of authority that promises to vindicate the anger, the worry, the frustrations of a great many people. And any time that we see across democracies a widespread politics of backlash and grievance, there's reason to worry. There's a reason to be critical of those who created the grievances, who I've argued often were the liberal technocratic elites who presided over a kind of neoliberal economy. Reason to be critical of those who created this opening. And we see this in many of the democratic countries now.
Russia, Ukraine, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Taiwan, US and India included.
Yes.
64 countries, but even if you look at the labels of those countries, I mean, there is nothing democratic about it.
Oh, I see. So you're saying, for example, when Putin is going to be elected, or some would say selected, even, is it really an election? Sort of. It's only sort of.
Do we need to, hope for democracy, or we need to redefine democracy?
I see. Yeah. Well, then that raises the question whether Putin's upcoming re-election, if we can call it a re-election, counts as truly democratic or not. It bears a certain formal similarity in that people do cast ballots, and the ballots are counted in some fashion. But if any serious opposition is banned and jailed, and its leaders are killed, to look at the Russian example, then even though it's an election, it's hard to call that a democracy.
What can we hope for?
Well, in the case of Russia, it's...
I'll just rephrase the question, and we can move on from this. Is there, of all the large major countries in the world, is there one country that you think is your best bet for thriving democracy today?
There isn't one that stands out. For a time, we were celebrating the young woman Prime Minister of New Zealand. Remember during
yes.
COVID, she seemed to really be.
Yeah.
But then, that didn't last very long. It's hard to find a single example to point to.
The question in the back there, Pavita has a mic, I think. Yeah, please.
Hello?
1 sec. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, hello, I'm Vedant, who's a school student. So at the beginning of your speech, you spoke about how political leaders are assuming that were assuming that globalization was the way forward. Do you think that's the same for other political doctrines, like say laissez-faire or democracy as a whole?
I missed the last part.
Sorry. So you said at the beginning of your speech,
Yeah, I heard
that globalization was assumed as the way forward. Do you think we're also assuming other political doctrines as correct? And do you think we should maybe deliberate on them more? Like laissez-faire and democracy?
Other political doctrines?
Like democracy as a whole and free market capitalism.
So
I didn't understand. Did you get the question?
So should we assume or should we debate whether democracy as a principle is correct, a correct way of governing? Is that your question?
Yes, and other political doctrines like that, like bigger things.
Bigger things. Well, I think, as I understand the question, we've been assuming here that democracy is a good thing, and we've been debating what counts as democracy. But the question you're raising, if I understand it, is, shouldn't we also be reflecting critically on whether democracy is the best way to organize a society or whether some other systems should be? Just as earlier in the discussion, I was calling into question whether neoliberal globalization is the best economic doctrine. Shouldn't we have a similar critical reflection on democracy itself? That's how I hear the question, and I think it's a serious question, and I think we should have that debate. And competing conceptions of democracy, we do we don't often debate them explicitly, but they underlie the arguments we have about how to govern ourselves and maybe bringing to the surface the more fundamental question about why democracy matters. Is it the best way of governing? Perhaps that would be a good thing and a healthy thing. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yes, the gentleman here in the front, please, and we'll, I think, take one more after that and wrap up.
Sandel, how do you rate the present-day Indian judiciary, whether it is standing up to a majoritarian government? You might have seen the election funding case, same-sex marriage case, and some of the cases in which the nature of places of worship is changing.
The nature of?
Places of worship.
Yes, places of worship.
So how do you rate the present-day Indian judiciary?
How do
you rate the present-day Indian judiciary? Can you make a quick comparison?
Rate the judiciary.
Indian judiciary.
In dealing with those questions.
Yes. And can you make a quick comparison with the Supreme Courts of US and Israel?
Well,
there's a related question here, so we'll take that.
A related question, yes. Go ahead.
So I actually wanted to keep it more general so that you could shape the question and the answer. This hope that we have, this dream almost that we have for a decent society and everything, what role do you see judiciary playing in it? And where do you think it has most lacked, be it in the US or be it in India? And where do you think it has best excelled, whichever country?
Yes. Well, thank you. So 2 questions about the judiciary. The judiciary at its best, especially in constitutional systems, constitutional democracies, the judiciary at its best not only adjudicates disputes and conflicting interpretations of the law, it also, in doing so, serves as an institution of civic education, which is why the opinions, not just the decisions, but the written opinions, offering the reasons, the justifications, these are important not just for legalistic reasons, not just to speak to the lawyers or to the litigants, but also as moments for civic education, especially where big public questions are being decided, such as the kinds of questions that the gentleman mentioned. And so this, I think, is one of the most important tests of the role the judiciary can play in a constitutional democracy. Safeguarding important rights under the Constitution, that's crucial. And we've discussed some of that tonight. Protecting those rights against majoritarian incursion and violation, that's an important role for the judiciary. But the civic education, explaining, offering justifications in opinions and in dissenting opinions, can model the kind of public discourse we here have been discussing. And as for my view of the Indian judiciary compared to the American judiciary, these days, I find myself admiring the Indian judiciary by contrast with some of the decisions the US Supreme Court has made of late.
Okay. There's a question. I already committed to somebody earlier. I forgot who. Yeah, that lady there at the back, please. Yes, we'll end with that last question. Please.
I think we've been asking you to solve a lot of problems for us, so here's one more. How do you ensure a free press when the government of the day kind of is the biggest advertiser and also uses its access to the media as a way of putting pressure on it?
And just
a related question, and add to it while we get the mic to her. You add to it.
No,
One sec, a mic will come to you. Just add to the question.
Add to it, how do you do good journalism when it also has to be entertaining and catch eyeballs and get advertising?
Right, okay.
Has social media
brought in more
closer or further away from free speech?
No, I think I've got it. I think social media has done more harm than help to the cause of free speech, properly understood. But it's impoverished speech and narrowed it. So I think it's done more harm than good. Now, on the I've lost track of the previous...
Journalism,
journalism, right.
Supported.
And if the media is dependent on advertising and other forms of payment from the government, what does that do to freedom of the press? And more broadly, the need to cater to ratings, the market, eyeballs. Both of those imperatives, to chase ratings or to win advertising from government or government agencies, is damaging to the free press. We were talking before about the public financing of campaigns as a way to lessen the power of money in politics. There's a parallel challenge with regard to freedom of the press, because if the media is funded in a way that is too beholden to powerful advertisers, whether those powerful advertisers be the national government or state governments or corporations or who care about the ratings, then we're likely to have a degradation in the quality, in the fearlessness, in the courage, and in the quality of coverage, of media coverage, which suggests that we may need to consider other ways, alternative kinds of media funded in ways that may be from not-for-profit, from civil society, alongside the profit-driven ones, not to the exclusion, but to see whether we can experiment with new forms of funding and support to support the kind of coverage that is necessary in a free society for democracy to flourish.
Yes, Rashmi has a question. And
In today's
go ahead.
In today's political strength in the world, how do you categorize as far as the strength of democracy is concerned from 1 to 10 or 0 to 10 in India, America, and China?
Always the toughest questions come from her, I've noticed that.
Yeah. Are you a journalist? No, you're not. Yeah, I think it's too, it involves nuanced qualitative judgments that can't be captured in numbers. I'm sorry, because the number would only make sense if it stood for a qualitative description of why and in what respect. So I would hesitate to put the numbers or a rank ordering.
Or you could just say good, bad, very good, excellent.
Yeah. Characterizing the state of democracy in these countries, I will say that that's, for the rapid fire round, something I would resist. In part for I think, a respectable reason. I mentioned before my ambition to contribute to global public discussion of these questions. One of the experiments that we did was, I mentioned the one with the BBC. I did a series of programs, and they continue, for NHK, which is Japan's public television network, where we assembled groups of students from the US, Japan, and China and discuss ethical and political dilemmas. And one of the programs we did was on democracy. And one of the debates we had across this group of students from the US, China, and Japan was, what counts as a democracy, and is China a democracy? And going into it, I think the American and Japanese students would have said, well, the answer is obviously no. The Chinese students, who admittedly had been very well prepared, but they were very, very strong debaters, going back to debate, and very sharp. They made the case, as the Chinese government a few years ago in a white paper made the case, that China is a democracy, but not a multi-party democracy. That multi-party, this was the argument, and you may consider it absurd on its face, but we had a serious discussion about whether multi-party competition is or is not the most effective way of democratic governance. And their argument was that democracy is governance for and on behalf of the people to promote the common good. And their argument was that by that measure, China arguably is more democratic than the United States. Now, the American students had their replies, as did the Japanese students. And although I don't think they were persuaded, the discussion did take seriously that argument. In the United States, for years upon years, we couldn't even pass public infrastructure spending. Our airports were deteriorating. The Chinese would look and say, you know, we can build a massive airport in the time, you know, it takes. You've allowed your infrastructure to decay. So the American students did have a challenging. They did have a challenge, and they took seriously the argument in responding to it. And if I had just invited them to put a number or excellent, good, fair, we would have missed something that was actually very important, and that even if it wasn't persuasive in the end to the American students, it did lead them to recognize and to acknowledge certain important respects in which the formal democratic institutions with the multi-party system in the United States may fall short of realizing the full measure of what democracy means, which goes back to much in our discussion about democracy being more than the majority prevailing,
Yes.
having to do with practices and habits of deliberation and argument and listening and mutual respect that that constitute democracy at its best.
Super. Okay, absolute last question. Sorry. Absolute last question. Please go ahead, fast. You don't have a mic. Okay, so get the mic here first, and please finish your question until the mic gets there. Yeah, just.
So I'll just ask you a question. Maybe it's not related. You spoke at the beginning about hollowing out of the public space. Now, 80% of Indians are Hindus, and the Hindu religion is pivoted on detachment. And at the same time, now there has been a kind of soaking of the public mind, at least of this 80% or part of it, in ritualistic religion, to the point of corrupting the shining pivot of detachment. As a philosopher, what do you think of this? And have you seen this in other parts, this magic realism, have you seen this in other parts of the world?
Well, what's fascinating about this question, and this question could keep us for an evening by itself. This is a fascinating question because we've been talking about the relation of religion and politics from the standpoint of politics and from the standpoint of democracy and minority rights and so on. But there's another whole aspect of this question that has to do with what becomes of religious traditions and spiritual traditions when they become bound up with a certain kind of politics. And what you've just suggested could be the starting point for a long discussion and debate about the impact of the political uses of faith traditions and spiritual traditions on those traditions and the mode of understanding. This gets into fascinating theological and philosophical questions, in particular about detachment and embeddedness from a religious point of view. So I don't have a quick answer except to say this is an enormously important and fascinating question. We've been discussing religion from the standpoint of politics, but the other half of the question philosophically is to think about religion and theology, and in particular Hindu faith and traditions and teaching from the standpoint of politics. And I would love to hear those who are far better qualified than I am to have an evening on this question. I would show up. I would tune in.
I'll just add one interesting, a little bit more complicated, to make this more fascinating and more complicated. In my view, I find the leader of the RSS, which is the big religious organization, the Hindu religious organization, I find whenever he speaks much more progressively and much more prime ministerially than the politicians in the BJP. So just to, even if you take the religion to the political side, just to create that, just quick, I couldn't resist that one. Yes, you've really, just really, really short.
Yeah. Since we've already covered a lot of facets revolving around a lot of integral topics,
short, yes.
I just digress with the discourse a bit. They say that providential dispensation is that you cannot really truly be happy at all times, right? And there's no one moment when you will feel only happiness in entirety. But I would want to know that one moment in your life when maybe you felt like your happiness at its peak and it's stopping, isolated with every other emotion. Or are we yet to await that moment?
Do you mean me personally or speaking?
You personally.
When my two sons were born, and I was there in the room with my wife when she gave birth to them, and whenever, and this is episodic over the course of our lives together, their lives, whenever I overhear in the next room our two sons talking together and laughing together with each other.
Wonderful. Professor Sandel, thank you so much for your time. You've been very patient. You've been indulging us with you've been taking all the complications and the questions. We really appreciate it. Professor Sandel is going to stay back to sign a few books for about 10 minutes. So if you guys are interested to hang on, please do. Thank you so much, really. Thank you for the audience. 2 hours you've been with us very patiently. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Sandel, Akash, Anand. I'd now like to invite Mr. Raj Kamal Jha, Chief Editor, The Indian Express, to present a token of appreciation to Mr. Sandel. This illustration is by Shubhajit Day. I'd also like to invite Dr. Rashmi Saluja, Executive Chairperson, Religare Enterprises Limited, to present Professor Sandel with a bouquet. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Saluja. As we conclude, I'd like to thank our partners. Presenting partner, Religare Enterprises Limited. Associate partners, Divans. Hospitality partner, Le Meridian. Please stay back for some cocktails and snacks. Thank you so much. Thank you for staying till 9 p.m. Thank you.